They called her Night Shift Barbie. The residents on the cardiac floor thought it was funny. Dr. Marcus Prescott started it during morning rounds, said it loud enough for 30 people to hear, the depth of a Mattel product and twice the plastic smile. He smiled when he said it. Everyone laughed. Natalie Hayes restocked the forecart and didn't look up. The next week, he called her adorable. Said her clinical suggestions were like watching a child play doctor. Said nursing school was coloring books compared to his medical degree. He wore a $12,000 watch when he said it, the kind that cost more than her car. She nodded, made a note on her tablet, and moved to the next patient without changing her expression. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. She had been trained by the United States Navy to absorb worse than words, to absorb fear, pain, and the weight of decisions that determined whether soldiers came home in uniforms or body bags. What Dr. Prescott didn't know was that the scars on her knuckles came from breaching doors in Mosul. What he didn't see was her posture, shoulders set back exactly 3 inches from perpendicular, weight centered evenly across both feet, eye scanning exits the way apex predators scan room perimeters. He didn't notice that when she moved through the cardiac floor at Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah, she moved like someone who had already survived the worst and had nothing left to lose. At 2,200 hours, she clocked in for the night shift. The hospital was still awake then. Visiting hours had ended at 9 p.m., but family members lingered in waiting rooms, phones glowing in their hands like prayer candles. The cardiac floor was quieter than day shift, fewer residents, fewer rounds, fewer voices questioning her decisions. She preferred it this way. Fewer people meant fewer opportunities for Dr. Prescott to remind the room of her limitations. Natalie moved through the cardiac ICU with practiced efficiency. Bed for a 73-year-old male, post-op day 3, coronary artery bypass. She checked his vitals without waking him. Blood pressure elevated. 71 systolic drop from the morning. She made a note. 48-hour post-op was normal territory for some fluctuation, but something in her chest tightened, the kind of instinctive warning that came from watching 847 patients survive and 43 die. Bed for C, a 56-year-old female, 2 days post-ablation. Heart rate steady. O2 sat 97%. Perfect. Natalie adjusted her blanket anyway, the way a nurse does when there's nothing wrong but everything feels like it might break. The residents on the floor watched her work. She could feel it. Not with fear, with something closer to relief. When Natalie was doing rounds, patients survived. When she moved through a room, small things got caught before they became emergencies. A resident named Chen had told her once, quietly, in the medication room where no one else could hear, "I trust your clinical judgment more than I trust my own." She had responded with 4 words, "Always verify with the attending." But Chen was a good resident. Chen would be a good doctor. He understood that judgment wasn't arrogance, it was pattern recognition built from years of reading bodies the way musicians read sheet music. At 2,347 hours, Dr. Prescott appeared on the cardiac floor. He wasn't supposed to be there. Night shift was staffed by a hospitalist named Dr. Chen, no relation to the resident, and a cardiologist on call. Prescott's schedule ended at 6 p.m. But he was here now, walking toward Natalie with the kind of purposeful stride that meant he had something to prove. "How's for A?" he asked. His voice had the texture of silk stretched over broken glass. Smooth until it wasn't. "Stable," Natalie said. "Vitals trending as expected for post-op day 3. She didn't mention the blood pressure drop. She had learned not to volunteer information Prescott didn't ask for. Extra words gave him ammunition. Good. He didn't even look at the chart. That's the problem with night shift nurses. Too much independence. You think you're doctors because the day shift lets you think out loud. Natalie turned to the next for line and didn't respond. Silence was its own kind of power. She had learned that in Kandahar province with her unit from the 75th Ranger Regiment, where talking too much got people killed. The lesson hadn't changed. Talking to Dr. Prescott only gave him oxygen. Adorable, he said, watching her work. That's what you are. Adorable. He left after that. But the word stayed. Adorable. Like she was a toy. Like her 17 years of nursing experience, the resuscitations, the emergency intubations, the 3 a.m. decisions that saved lives, was nothing more than a cute party trick. At 0100 hours, her phone buzzed in her locker. She was restocking the supply closet, counting cardiac medications against the pharmacy log. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous hymn. Antiseptic burned her nostrils, that chemical tang of bleach and isopropyl alcohol that never quite faded from hospital walls. Her phone screen lit up with a call. Her son's name. Tyler. 16 years old. Shouldn't be awake at 1 a.m. She answered before the second ring. Hey, baby. Everything okay? Mom. His voice had that careful quality, the tone kids use when they're about to say something they've been rehearsing. I wanted to tell you about my commanding officer. During the officer selection course. You're still in high school, Natalie said, but her voice was already listening differently. Already shifting into the frequency of mothers whose children were becoming other people. I know, but we have this leadership program. And one of the instructors, his name is Colonel David Marsh. He's like really hard on everyone, but he knows what he's doing. The cadets who train under him, they all say he's the best. They say he doesn't waste time on soldiers who can't cut it. The supply closet suddenly felt smaller. Natalie touched them the way other people touch photographs. Her hands had breached doors. Her hands had applied tourniquets. Her hands had held the throats of men trying to kill her unit while her team extracted intelligence that saved 847 American lives over the next 4 years. Her calluses had been earned in temperatures that reached 127 degrees Fahrenheit. Her scars told stories that had never been declassified and never would be, because Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes was a woman who officially didn't exist. The Pentagon had erased her after the operation went sideways, after certain decisions were made about who would be held accountable, and those decisions led to exactly one outcome: everyone involved was buried so deep that even their own families couldn't retrieve them. 15 years that had happened. 15 years that had been dissolved into a redacted file somewhere in a basement at the Pentagon. She had become a nurse because she needed to save people who were still alive, who still had futures, who didn't need to be killed by systems designed to protect themselves. She had become Natalie Hayes because Nomad, the call sign they had given her, because she had no fixed position on any team, because she was the one they sent when standard protocols didn't work. Nomad could not exist in a hospital parking lot in Savannah, Georgia. But Nomad's boots were still in the locker. And her 16-year-old son was becoming the kind of soldier who needed people like Colonel David Marsh to survive his first deployment. And Dr. Prescott was still calling her adorable. And everything she had buried was starting to surface like bodies after a flood. She closed the locker and returned to the cardiac floor at 0128 hours. The night was still young. 8 hours of shift remaining. 8 hours of restocking carts and checking vitals and watching residents and keeping Dr. Prescott's patients alive even while he questioned her right to exist. She moved through the hallway with the mechanical precision of someone operating on habit instead of hope. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. And then, at 0147 hours, she heard the footsteps that didn't belong. Heavy. Irregular. Moving toward the cardiac ICU from the direction of the stairwell. And underneath the footsteps, another sound, labored breathing, the kind that came from fear or exertion or both. Natalie's body recognized the audio signature before her conscious mind caught up. She turned toward the sound. A man. 250 pounds if he was one. Street clothes instead of a hospital gown. Hospital bracelet dangling from his wrist, the plastic band torn. And in his right hand, catching the fluorescent light as his arm trembled, something metallic. Something that made her entire nervous system shift into a frequency it hadn't occupied in 8 years. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilators humming in the rooms behind him. The hallway held its breath. Security hadn't arrived yet. 3 minutes out, dispatch had said. 3 minutes stretched into geological time when you were standing between a 250-pound drunk man and a cardiac patient on the 3rd floor of Cedar Creek Medical. The man was still shouting, his voice a sledgehammer against the fluorescent-lit quiet of night shift. His work boots, steel-toed, mud-caked, scraped against the linoleum as he lurched toward room 4B. The voice belonged to someone's son, probably. Someone's husband. Someone's catastrophe wearing human skin and whiskey sweat. Natalie moved without deciding to move. Muscle memory. The same frequency her nervous system had locked onto weeks earlier when she'd first seen the name on the admission chart. Colonel David Marsh. For Big Jake's commanding officer. 3 weeks before this moment, Dr. Prescott had projected her care plan across a screen in grand rounds like it was a Renaissance painting made of mistakes. 30 staff members. Auditorium seating. The post-cab patient in for a 71-year-old widow who'd survived coronary artery bypass surgery by 6 hours. Natalie had documented modified chest physiotherapy protocols based on the patient's reduced lung capacity and fragile sternum. Here we have an example of nursing overreach, Dr. Prescott announced, his voice carrying the particular crystalline cruelty of someone who'd never had to apologize for anything in his life. His fingers moved across the keyboard. Her credentials appeared on screen, associate degree in nursing, Savannah Technical College, 2018. He paused. Let the audience read. Let them calculate what 2 years of community college meant against his Harvard Medical School diploma framed in the corner office 3 floors above them. How charming that someone with a 2-year degree thinks she can redesign respiratory therapy protocols, he continued. His smile was a blade-catching light. Perhaps next she'll want to scrub in on my bypass procedures. Should we get her some crayons to draw the incision lines? Scattered nervous laughter. The kind that evaporates quickly because people know, somehow, that they're witnessing something that will matter later. Natalie stood against the back wall, clipboard held in both hands, jaw muscles tight as piano wire. Her face was a photograph, composed, blank, the visual equivalent of radio silence. Her knuckles whitened against the clipboard. Nothing else moved. Not her shoulders. Not her breathing. Just the knuckles, betraying the truth her face refused to admit. He continued for another 3 minutes, pulling apart her clinical reasoning like a boy pulling the wings off insects. The room absorbed his words like antiseptic-soaked gauze. When grand rounds ended, she walked past him with the same neutral expression, returned to the floor, and charted her post-op assessments with hands steady enough to be surgical. But the vending machine came the following week. She needed coffee. Actual coffee, not the lukewarm compensation the break room offered in a pot that had been brewing since 0600. The vending machine by the ICU never disappointed, decent espresso in a paper cup, the small machine humming its mechanical rhythm like a patient on life support. Dr. Prescott was there. Not coincidentally. She'd begun to understand that he scheduled his movements around hers now, the way a predator learns the parts of prey. 3 nurses nearby. 2 residents. An audience. Natalie, I've been meaning to ask, he said, retrieving his own coffee with the deliberate timing of someone performing for an invisible spotlight. Do they teach pharmacokinetics in nursing school? Or is it all bedpan management and taking temperatures? She reached past him. Her hand was steady. This was the thing about suppressing panic for 16 years, it became as automatic as breathing. I only ask because you keep making clinical suggestions to my residents, he continued, louder now, making sure the 3 nurses heard clearly. And I worry you might be confused about the limits of your limited education. She lifted her coffee. Met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The eye contact was a risk, it asked him to see her, but she held it anyway, long enough for him to understand that she wasn't intimidated, just uninterested in his words. Then she turned away. Her hand trembled as she lifted the cup. Just once. Just barely visible. The trembling lasted approximately 1.3 seconds before the muscle fibers corrected themselves and her grip stabilized. She felt him watching, felt the confusion flicker across his face when she didn't respond, didn't defend herself, didn't break. Just left. Just returned to her rounds as if he'd commented on the weather. That was Thursday of the second week. The third incident came on a Tuesday during afternoon rounds. The valve replacement patient in 4D was presenting signs of pulmonary edema, bilateral RALs, declining O2 saturation, the particular raspy quality to his breathing that told her before the monitor confirmed it. She was documenting the changes when Dr. Prescott arrived, reviewed the vitals, and ordered a medication regimen that would have lowered the patient's diuretic support. Exactly backward. That order is contraindicated, Natalie said quietly. Not a question. Just a statement of medical fact, the way you'd observe that the sky was grey and the rain was falling. His head turned. His voice dropped to that particular register that meant danger, the voice of someone who'd never learned that quiet doesn't mean calm. Nurse Hayes, I'm going to call security to escort you from this floor for insubordination. Perhaps you need a reminder of where you stand in the hospital hierarchy. She held his gaze. Utterly still. Then simply nodded, returned to her medication cart, and continued her rounds as if he'd mentioned the weather. She charted the order anyway, documented his directive and her objection side by side, which was what you did when protocol mattered more than pride. But that was during daylight. That was with 30 people in the hallway. What happened 3 hours later, at 0347, in the supply closet with the door locked, that was different. The supply closet smelled like bleach and plastic tubing. Cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, for bags arranged in methodical rows, the particular staleness of a room that never got fresh air. She gripped the metal shelf. Just gripped it. Her hand started to shake, and she didn't fight it this time. Didn't suppress it. Didn't channel it into composure the way she'd been trained to do 17 years ago by Petty Officer Specialist Rodriguez in a classroom where learning to contain your fear was the difference between coming home and not coming home. Her whole body trembled for 90 seconds. Her legs didn't hold. She sat on an overturned crate and closed her eyes and breathed the way the therapist had taught her, in through the nose, for counts, hold for 6, out for 8. Breathe like you're underwater and the surface is too far to reach, but you have to try anyway. Master Chiefs didn't cry. That was the rule. The rule that had carried her through 3 tours, through the operation in Mosul that no one was allowed to remember, through 8 years of working a hospital where she wore scrubs instead of combat fatigues and pushed medicine instead of pushing back against people who wanted to kill Americans. So she didn't cry. But her whole body shook. Her hands trembled against her thighs. And for the first time since arriving at Cedar Creek Medical, Natalie Hayes let the facade crack, just barely, just enough, just for 90 seconds behind a locked supply closet door. Then she straightened. Smoothed her scrubs. Checked her reflection in the darkened window of the forewarming device. Held her own eyes in the glass for 3 seconds. Nodded at the woman looking back. Walked out at 0348, returned to the floor, and spent the rest of the night rounds with the same quiet competence she'd always offered, the same stone-faced professionalism that made Dr. Prescott's face darken with frustration every single time he watched her absorb his contempt and refuse to shatter. What neither of them knew, what only she knew, was that the patient being admitted to 4B tomorrow would fundamentally change everything. Colonel David Marsh, commander of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The man who'd written the deployment orders that sent her 19-year-old son, Jake Michael Hayes, across an ocean. The man who decided which missions her boy got assigned to. The man who held her child's life in the kind of hands that sign orders in triplicate. And at 0352, when dispatch called in a community-acquired pneumonia case coming by ambulance from Savannah Regional, when Natalie pulled the admission screen and saw those 3 words, Colonel David Marsh, her entire nervous system shifted again. Not into fear. Not into panic. Into operational mode. The frequency that didn't know how to back down. The frequency that had survived Mosul. She touched the combat boots in her locker for a long moment. Held them like they were a letter from home. Then she returned to charting, because the night shift still had 5 hours remaining and Cedar Creek Medical was about to become something neither Dr. Prescott nor his contempt could control anymore. Colonel David Marsh arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 16:47, his breathing shallow, his chest tight with the kind of ache that wouldn't quit. Community-acquired pneumonia, the admitting physician had said, stable for now, but the way the oxygen saturation kept drifting downward suggested the infection was winning its argument with his immune system. He was a man accustomed to winning arguments. 53 years old, decorated, commanded respect the way other men commanded breath, naturally, without effort. Room for B on the cardiac floor. Isolation precaution, just in case. Natalie saw the name on the admission chart at 1712, and her vision narrowed like a scope closing in on a target she hadn't expected to find. Colonel David Marsh. The name didn't belong here, in this fluorescent-lit hallway where she'd spent 8 years hiding in plain sight. It belonged in official correspondence, in her son's cautious voice on encrypted calls home, in the chain of command that held her child's life in carefully documented balance. Her hands steadied themselves without conscious instruction. Muscle memory had its own logic. She kept moving, kept charting, kept her face the texture of calm water while underneath her rib something tightened like a fist. She'd never met him in person. Not once. That was the point of the separation between her hidden life and his official world. But she knew his file the way a hunter knows the terrain before the hunt begins. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Commanding officer of her son's platoon. The man whose signature would determine whether her child came home whole or came home folded into a flag. The man who, 3 months ago, had recommended her son for advanced sniper certification. The man who, in her own service years, would have been considered a warrior of the first rank. The kind of officer who led from the front and lost sleep over his people. The evening shift proceeded with the familiar rhythm of hospital work. Natalie checked Marsh's vitals at 18:30. His oxygen sat at 91%. His temperature had crept up to 101.4. The bacterial pneumonia was methodical, patient, like an enemy with nowhere else to be. She documented everything, moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced the motions 10,000 times, and never once allowed her eyes to rest on his face for longer than the clinical necessity demanded. Then the violence arrived at 21:47. The man appeared in the hallway without warning, a wall of muscle and aggression, wearing a stained work shirt and boots covered in what might have been gravel or might have been something worse. 250 pounds of intoxicated anger, reeking of whiskey and cigarettes, his right hand gripping a box cutter like it was a question he intended to ask in the most direct way possible. He was screaming about his brother. Supposedly admitted. Room number he'd gotten wrong by 3 digits, which made the screaming louder, which made the wrongness somehow worse. My brother's here. You people took him. I know he's here. His voice had the quality of a diesel engine running too hot, the kind of sound that made every mammal in the vicinity understand, on some primal frequency, that danger had just walked through the door. Visitors in the waiting area shifted away. A resident at the nurse's station froze, his pen hovering over a chart like he'd forgotten what writing was supposed to accomplish. Natalie was in room for B, checking the fall line. She heard the commotion, processed it, understood the trajectory. The man was 6 feet away from Colonel Marsh's door. She moved into the hallway with the kind of smooth, unhurried motion that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times before, which she had, just not in a hospital. Sir, visiting hours ended at 9 o'clock. Her voice was level, calibrated, the exact frequency that made people inclined to listen. I need you to come with me now. The man wheeled toward her, and she saw the calculation happen behind his eyes. He was seeing a woman in scrubs, maybe 140 pounds, dark hair pulled back, hands steady at her sides. He was seeing someone whose threat assessment rated at 0. He was, in approximately 4 seconds, going to discover he was profoundly wrong about that. You gonna stop me, little girl? He laughed, a wet, ugly sound like a drain backing up. He took a step toward her. She didn't retreat. Didn't raise her hands. Didn't change her breathing pattern. She just shifted her weight slightly, her stance widening by 3 inches, her center of gravity dropping in a way that 15 years of close-quarters combat had drilled into muscle memory so deep it was indistinguishable from bone. "Sir, last chance. Come with me now." Her voice hadn't changed. Still calm. Still level. Still carrying the specific weight of someone who'd given orders under fire and watched people obey them. He lunged. What happened next took for 0.7 seconds. She sidestepped, redirected his momentum, drove her elbow into the nerve cluster below his shoulder with the kind of precision that made pain into information. His arm went numb. He staggered. She swept his leg, rode him down with a knee on his spine and his arm locked at an angle that made resistance not just difficult but physically impossible. The box cutter skittered across the tile floor, spinning like a compass needle looking for north. His face hit linoleum. His breath came out in gasps. He wasn't going anywhere, not without cooperation from muscles she'd just convinced to stop working. She wasn't breathing hard. 2 residents witnessed the entire sequence from the nurse's station. Their mouths opened simultaneously, like synchronized fish in an aquarium suddenly understanding that the tank had rules they'd never bothered to learn. A nurse manager who'd been at her computer looked up. Another resident blinked 3 times. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the man's ragged breathing and the distant beep of a cardiac monitor somewhere else on the floor, a rhythm that continued indifferent to what had just occurred. Security arrived in under 90 seconds. Found the man in professional restraints, Natalie calmly providing a report with her scrubs not even wrinkled, her hair still perfectly tight, her voice still that strange, flat calm that suggested she'd either just saved everyone or committed violence so efficient that the distinction between the two had ceased to matter. The intoxicated man was crying now, his arm screaming with the kind of pain that comes from understanding, for the first time in his life, that he'd chosen the wrong person to underestimate. She'd learned the technique in a compound outside Fallujah in 2009. Close-quarters combat against an enemy that didn't believe in half measures. The instructors had been special forces operators who'd evolved past textbook training into something else entirely. Something that moved like water and hit like concrete. She'd been the fastest learner in that rotation. The quietest. The one the instructors didn't have to shout at because she understood what they meant by watching their hands instead of listening to their words. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the story had spread through Cedar Creek Medical like an infection finding new territory. By 8 o'clock, Dr. Prescott had heard 6 different versions, each one slightly more exaggerated than the last. By 9 o'clock, he was in the Chief of Staff's office, his voice taking on that particular quality that meant he was spinning narrative, painting the incident as dangerous vigilantism, as liability exposure, as evidence that Natalie Hayes represented a threat to the hospital's careful insurance calculations. He didn't ask where she'd learned those techniques. He didn't want to know. He just wanted her gone, wanted the woman who'd humiliated him subtly across 3 separate incidents to disappear before she made him understand, with absolute clarity, just how far below her he actually ranked. She spent the day in her usual routine. Charting. Vitals. For checks. Moving through Cedar Creek Medical like she'd always moved through rooms where death was a possibility and precision was the only thing standing between order and chaos. She felt the stares. Felt the whispers. Felt the particular quality of attention that comes when people understand they've been occupying the same space as someone far more dangerous than her title suggested. Colonel Marsh improved slightly as the afternoon wore on. His oxygen sat at 93% by 4 p.m. His fever had stabilized. The antibiotics were working their way through his system, killing bacteria with the methodical efficiency of anything designed by military science to eliminate a specific target. At 2:47, all of that changed. The alarm started as a whisper and became a scream. His oxygen saturation dropped like someone had opened a valve. 92. 88. 84. His heart rate spiked. 118, 134, 152, climbing the scale in the way that meant his body understood something his conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. Tension pneumothorax. His lung collapsing as his body filled with air where air had no business being. Every breath becoming harder. Every heartbeat becoming more desperate. Natalie was there in 6 seconds. Every heartbeat becoming more desperate. Natalie was there in 6 seconds. Room 4B had descended into the primal chaos of dying, alarms screaming in overlapping pitches, the ventilator gasping like something drowning in air instead of breathing it. Colonel David Marsh lay on the hospital bed, his chest heaving, his skin the color of old bruises, his eyes wide and rolling as his body fought a war it was already losing. His trachea had shifted visibly to the right. His neck veins bulged like cables about to snap. The right side of his chest was silent, no breath sounds, no movement, just the flat absence of life where lungs should be exchanging oxygen. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. A pressure pocket of air between the lung and chest wall, compressing his heart, suffocating him from the inside. He had maybe 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. The code cart was still being wheeled from Trauma 2, 3 doors down. Nobody was in the room yet except Natalie and a respiratory therapist frozen in place, eyes wide, hands trembling uselessly. The therapist looked at Natalie. "What do we?" "Get that cart. Now. Tell them pneumo. Stat." She was already moving, already calm in the way that comes from having already survived the worst. Muscle memory took over. Her hands became instruments. She was reaching into the crash cart drawer, nothing there, and then she was gone, down the hallway in 4 strides, pushing through the staff locker room door like it owed her money. Her locker. Bottom shelf. The go bag she'd kept packed for 15 years because old habits don't die, they just wait. The MRE was in the inside pocket. Meals ready to eat. Military issue. She'd kept 3 of them since Mosul, since the last field operation that officially never happened. Nobody asks why a floor nurse carries military rations. Nobody asks a lot of things if you don't give them reasons to look. Her fingers tore the wrapper open, the plastic crackling like breaking ribs. The inner lining came free, smooth, non-porous, designed to seal and hold. Designed for exactly this. She'd trained on this. She'd done this before, in a Humvee burning under fire while bullets came through the windows like angry wasps. This was different. This was controlled. This was a man who held her son's life in his hands, and his life was now in hers. Back to 4B in 8 seconds flat. Marsh was more cyanotic now. His oxygen saturation was somewhere below survivable. His heart rate was climbing because his heart knew it was dying. The respiratory therapist was still standing there, still paralyzed. "I need the cardiac crash kit." "The dressing. Now." The therapist moved. Finally moved. Natalie didn't ask permission. Didn't call for an attending. Didn't wait for protocol. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical map of emergency, the location where needle decompression had been pulling people back from the edge of death since the concept of emergency medicine existed. She'd learned this location in training that the Pentagon said never happened. She'd used it on a Marine named Rodriguez in 2009, in a vehicle that was cooking off ammunition in 120-degree heat. She got a 14-gauge needle. The crash kit had one. She positioned it perpendicular to his chest wall, above the 3rd rib to avoid the vessels running below it. All the old knowledge came forward like soldiers answering a call they'd been waiting for their whole lives. Her hands were steady. This was data. This was information. This was a life that could be saved if her hands were good enough. The needle went in. The hiss came immediately, a controlled release, like opening a pressure valve on a system that had been about to explode. The sound of air escaping from a collapsed lung cavity. The sound of death stepping back an inch. She taped the MRE wrapper over the wound site, leaving one edge deliberately open. A flutter valve. Pressure could escape but air couldn't get back in. It was improvised and it was technically not protocol and it was going to keep him alive until someone could get a proper chest tube in his ribs. Marsh's color was already changing. The gray was fading. The cyanosis was retreating. His oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed, 68. 71, 76. 81. His heart rate, which had been climbing toward the sky, began to normalize. His breathing became less frantic, less desperate. The desperate silence of a dying man was being replaced by the sound of lungs that remembered how to work. The code team arrived. The full team. Attending, residents, nurses, respiratory therapy. They saw the MRE wrapper. They saw the needle placement. They saw that the patient was stabilizing instead of dying. What happened? The attending, Dr. Keisha Martinez, one of the good ones, looked at the wrapper and then at Natalie. Tension pneumo. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular. Field seal using improvised materials while we waited for the cart. Martinez assessed everything in 3 seconds. She nodded to the resident. Get a 32 French chest tube. We need a thoracostomy. Now. The resident was already moving. The team flowed around marsh-like water around a stone, competent and coordinated. Natalie stepped back. She'd done her part. The medical system could take it from here. The chest tube went in cleanly. The hiss was bigger this time, the professional release of air that had been slowly killing a man. Marsh's vital signs stabilized completely. His color normalized. His oxygen saturation climbed to 94% and held steady. A man who had been 3 minutes from death was now breathing. Alive. Salvageable. Martinez looked at Natalie once, held her eyes for a long moment, and nodded. That was the moment it all changed. Dr. Prescott arrived 4 minutes later. He stood in the doorway of 4B, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to something colder. He saw the MRE wrapper on the crash cart, the proof that something outside protocol had occurred in his hospital. His eyes narrowed. He picked it up between his thumb and forefinger like it was contaminated. Who used this? Nobody answered. But Natalie was standing right there, and Prescott had spent 3 weeks learning to read her face. He knew. You. Not a question. A sentence. You put this in a patient's body. It saved his life, Natalie said. Her voice was level. Professional. Nothing underneath it. Tension pneumothorax. Code team was 3 doors down. This was the appropriate field intervention. This is not a field. This is a hospital. We have protocols. Yes, sir. That obedience, the muscle memory of deference, the way she said sir, that was what Prescott needed. That small acknowledgement that he had authority. He clutched it like a drowning man finding driftwood. He left the room. His phone was already in his hand. By 800 hours, 3 calls had been made. The first to board member Harrison, who owed Prescott for a lucrative cardiology referral network that had brought in $500,000 in annual billing. The second to the hospital's legal counsel, who listened as Prescott explained the concept of liability exposure, a foreign object inserted into a patient's body, however successful the outcome, was a documentation nightmare and a lawsuit waiting to happen. The third to Dr. Jerome Calloway, who chaired the hospital's independent medical review board and who had received exactly 3 high-paying consulting contracts from Prescott's private practice over the past 5 years. By 1100 hours, the review board had convened. 3 physicians. All personally vetted. All understanding what Prescott needed them to understand. By 1400 hours, Natalie was in an HR conference room on the 4th floor, the carpet gray and the lights fluorescent bright, the kind of room where bad news came to live. Prescott was there. He'd brought documentation. He'd brought the wrapper, photographed and logged. He'd brought the liability argument, wrapped in the language of patient safety and professional standards. Nurse Hayes violated established protocol, Prescott said, his voice carrying the right amount of regret. Like this pained him. Like he was doing the difficult but necessary thing. She inserted a non-sterile foreign object into a patient's thoracic cavity. I cannot in good conscience allow someone this reckless to continue caring for our patients. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Chen, looked at Natalie. "Do you have military medical training?" "Yes." "Can you provide documentation?" Natalie didn't answer for a long moment. In that silence was everything. 15 years of service. 7 combat deployments. Operations in Mosul and Helmand and Sanjin. A code name that had been used in briefing rooms at the Pentagon. A service record that had been deliberately erased as part of a classified aftermath, a decision made at the highest levels of command to make Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes officially cease to exist. "I don't have accessible military records," she said finally. Her voice was still level, still controlled. "My service was complicated. The records are sealed." Prescott smiled. Slightly. "That's convenient. I can perform the procedure again. I can explain every step. The patient survived. His vital signs are stable. There's no injury." "That's not the point," Chen said gently. "The point is whether you were authorized to do this. And the review board has determined that you weren't. That you acted outside your scope." The 3 physicians on the review board had signed their names. The recommendation was unanimous. Natalie Hayes was a liability. Natalie Hayes was reckless. Natalie Hayes was terminated for gross protocol violation and practicing outside the scope of a registered nurse's license. At 14:23 hours, Natalie handed over her badge. The laminated card that said Cedar Creek Medical. The access code that had let her walk these floors for 8 years. The identity that was more real than the one the Pentagon said she didn't have. She drove home in silence. The rain had started, a low warm rain that hammered the windshield like applause nobody asked for. Her hands were still steady on the wheel. Her face was still composed. She wasn't trembling. Not yet. At 14:47, the door opened. Jake came in from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his uniform, the Drock cadet uniform he wore with the same discipline she'd taught him, still buttoned correctly. He looked for her the way kids do, that quick scan to locate the parent, to know the house was safe. He found her at the kitchen table. Still in scrubs. Still in the uniform of someone who didn't exist anymore. Her shoulders were shaking. Silently. The way shoulders shake when the person attached to them has finally, after so many years, run out of composure to give. "Mom." His voice was small. Frightened. The voice of a child who had never seen his mother break before. "Why are you home early?" She couldn't answer. Couldn't look at him. Couldn't explain that the life she'd been building, the new identity, the normal hospital, the quiet redemption, had just collapsed under the weight of a man who needed to destroy her to feel powerful. The rain hammered the windows. The house was quiet except for that. Just a boy and his mother, and everything that was about to change. But she didn't know that yet. She only knew that she was broken, and for the first time in 15 years, she didn't know how to fix it. 72 hours later, the sound would be everything. The deep rumble of heavy engines. The synchronized rhythm of a military convoy. Pentagon plates. Marines in dress blues walking into Cedar Creek Medical and saying a name that officially didn't exist. But that was after. First, there was just this, the kitchen, the rain, the sobs, and a 10-year-old boy who was about to learn that his mother was so much more than he'd ever imagined. The morning light came grey through the administrator's office windows, and it carried the smell of old coffee and furniture polish, the antiseptic smell of institutional power. Natalie sat in the chair across from Patricia Chen, the hospital administrator, and 2 seats over from Dr. Marcus Prescott, who had arranged himself with the precision of a man confident in his victory. His fingers were laced on the table. His jaw was set. He looked like someone who had already rehearsed this moment a dozen times in the mirror. Patricia opened a folder. Inside were documents. Natalie recognized her handwriting on some of them, patient notes, clinical decisions, timestamps. But next to her notes were others, paper she had never seen before. Complaints dated 3 weeks back. A warning memo she had never received. A pattern, carefully constructed, that painted her as reckless, as a nurse who had exceeded her authority repeatedly. "We've convened an independent medical review board," Patricia said, and her voice was careful, the voice of someone reading from a script she hadn't written. 3 members, all external consultants. They reviewed the incident with Colonel Marsh last week. The use of non-standard materials. The deviation from protocol. Prescott nodded slowly, as if the words were his own, as if his network of favors and careful phone calls over the past 18 hours had simply confirmed what everyone already knew. 3 board members. Natalie knew the names before they were spoken. Dr. Harold Feynman from Atlanta, who owed Prescott a recommendation letter for his daughter's fellowship application. Dr. Susan Rothstein from Jacksonville, whose research grant had been approved through a committee Prescott chaired. Dr. William Cross from Augusta, a cardiologist who golfed with Prescott twice a month at Palmetto Dunes. These were not independent consultants. These were coins Prescott had been collecting for years, now cashed in, all at once. Your intervention, while well-intentioned, Patricia continued, constituted practicing outside your scope of practice. The board's conclusion is unanimous. The room was very quiet. Natalie could hear the fluorescent lights above, not humming, she corrected herself. They hummed in segment 2. These lights were still. The silence was so complete that she could hear the rain starting outside, a soft percussion against the glass, like fingers tapping impatiently. Effective immediately, Patricia said, Cedar Creek Medical is terminating your employment. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address. Your benefits will end on the last day of this month. HR will escort you to retrieve your personal items from your locker. Natalie didn't move. Didn't blink. The composure that had held her through 15 years of actual combat, through ambushes in Mosul and losses in the Jolan district, held now in a hospital administrator's office against a man who confused credentials with character. She looked at Prescott. He was watching her carefully, almost hungrily, waiting for the mask to crack, for the moment when the quiet nurse would finally break. She didn't give him that moment. Instead, she stood. The chair made a soft scraping sound against the linoleum. She said nothing. She turned and walked toward the door, her movements precise, her shoulders back, the posture of someone who had survived far worse than a board member's betrayal. Behind her, she heard Prescott exhale, satisfaction, or relief, or perhaps the first small exhalation of a man who had just made the worst decision of his professional life and didn't yet understand it. The HR office was on the 2nd floor. A woman named Deb, who had hired Natalie 8 years ago and had always treated her with genuine kindness, was waiting with a cardboard box and a form for Natalie to sign. The form was a severance agreement. It included language about confidentiality, about not discussing the termination, about acknowledging that the separation was mutual and without cause for legal action. I need to ask you some questions about your background, Deb said quietly. She was uncomfortable. Her hands were fidgeting with a pen. For our records, we need to update your file. Educational credentials, prior employment history, military service if applicable. Natalie sat down. The box was on her lap. I've maintained the same background information I provided during my initial hiring, she said. Her voice was level. 8 years ago. Everything is documented as provided at that time. Deb consulted the file. Nursing degree from University of Florida, graduated 2011. Prior work experience at Shands Teaching Hospital, 2011 to 2015. No military service listed. That was the cover story. The one the Pentagon had constructed when they decided that Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, call sign Nomad, was safer erased than remembered. A normal nursing timeline. A normal progression. No gaps. No classified operations. No 15 years of service records that officially did not exist because the operation she participated in did not exist either. That's correct, Natalie said. And you don't have any other references we could contact? From earlier positions? Former supervisors? No. The word hung in the air. Deb waited, as if expecting an explanation that Natalie couldn't provide. How could she explain that her supervisors during those 15 years had clearance levels that made hospital HR paperwork look like a child's coloring book? How could she explain that phone calls to her former commanders would trigger protocol so classified that it would probably end with federal agents asking Deb very uncomfortable questions about what she had just asked? "All right," Deb said finally. She slid the form across the desk. "Just sign here. 3 copies. One for us, one for your records, one for the state licensing board." The pen felt strange in Natalie's hand. She had held weapons that felt more natural. She signed her name 3 times and slid the papers back. And that was the moment it became official. Not the firing. That had happened when Patricia spoke the words. But this was the moment when Natalie Hayes, the nurse, ceased to exist as far as Cedar Creek Medical was concerned. Another piece of her erased. Not by the Pentagon this time, but by a man with a wounded ego and 3 phone calls. The drive home took 17 minutes. The rain was heavier now, hammering the windshield of her 2009 Honda Civic with the persistence of something alive, something angry. Her scrubs were still damp. She hadn't changed. She had walked out of the administrator's office and straight to her locker, and with Deb watching, she had retrieved her stethoscope, her trauma shears, her badge, and the small personal items she kept on the shelf. The combat boots. She had wanted to reach for them, to touch the worn leather one more time, to remember Mosul, to remember who she was beneath the lies and the cover story and the invisible service record. But Deb was watching. So she left them there. The boots stayed on the shelf. Another small piece left behind. The house was quiet when she arrived. Her son Jake wouldn't be home from school for another 3 hours. She sat at the kitchen table with her scrubs still clinging to her skin, damp and cold, and she put her head in her hands. The rain continued outside. The kitchen was dark except for the grey light filtering through the windows. And at exactly 2:47 p.m., she checked the clock. The front door opened. Jake stood in the doorway with his backpack and his questions, his small face confused, his voice small when he spoke. "Mom? Why are you home? It's not even 3 yet." She couldn't speak. The composure that had held through everything, through deployments and ambushes and watching men die, through Prescott's campaign of contempt, through the firing itself, the composure finally shattered. Not explosively. Not with drama. It simply broke like a dam that had held too long, and the tears came quietly, unstoppably, while her son stood confused in the kitchen doorway, trying to understand why his mother was broken. "Why do you look so sad?" he asked. Did something happen? Yes, she wanted to say. Something happened. The world found out that I'm a trained killer, and so I lost the only identity I was allowed to keep. Or, I saved a man's life and got fired for it. Or, I kept silent for 15 years, and the silence finally caught up with me. Instead, she said nothing. She just sat there while her son dropped his backpack and came to her, and wrapped his arms around her shoulders, the way she had wrapped her arms around so many others, in so many places, in so many wars that hadn't happened according to official records. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of applications and resume updates, phone calls to nursing agencies, and carefully worded explanations to people who wanted to know why Cedar Creek Medical had let her go. She didn't mention Prescott. She didn't mention the fabricated complaints or the board members who had rubber-stamped his revenge. She simply said it wasn't a good fit and moved on. But at dawn on the 3rd morning, everything changed. 2 black SUVs pulled into the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot with the kind of precision that suggested the drivers had done this many times before. Behind them came a staff car with Pentagon plates, and the seal on the door gleamed in the early light like a promise or a warning. Men in dark suits emerged. One of them, a captain in marine dress blues underneath a waterproof cover, walked directly to the reception desk. "I need to speak with someone in authority," he said. "Immediately. We're looking for a Master Chief Petty Officer. Call sign Nomad. She may be known here under a different name." The receptionist's face went very pale. She picked up the phone. And in his office on the third floor, Dr. Marcus Prescott, who was reviewing the criminal complaint his attorney had just delivered, felt all the blood drain from his face when he heard the words transmitted through the hospital intercom. The color didn't come back. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments. We'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.